that. All set. So if you would like to host a field trip with your chapter, if you have a great idea for it, my email is on the screen. Just shoot me an email with your idea and we'll get started on putting one together. So without further ado, remember if you have questions or comments from Margaret, use the chat box in your screen. But right now I'll hand it over to Margaret for her presentation on the Crossways Preserve.
All right, thank you, Kelly. And thanks to PA Audubon for this awesome idea. I'm really excited to be able to share this preserve with everybody. So I'm mission manager for Wissahickon Trails, and we just changed our name this month. So we were previously known as the Wissahickon Valley Watershed Association. So if I refer to us as the watershed, that's why, because I'm still getting used to that name change. So as a mission manager, I oversee all of our habitat restoration and trail and preserve maintenance and bird conservation. And I've served on the Wyncote Audubon board since, I think, 2016. So, oh no. Kelly, did I get that?
You've got it now.
Okay. How do I get it back?
Let's see if I can take it for you.
Okay, doing things, but it's not reacting. Please hold, everybody.
Your slide. Okay, hang on 1 second.
Okay.
Stop that for a second. Get right back up on the screen.
Okay, let me make sure it goes forward and back. Okay, I think it's good now. Oh God. Struggles. Okay. Okay, I think it's good now. All right, so there's a lot of names that I recognize that are tuning in, and that's really awesome. There's a lot of people that are new. So I just want to tell you a little bit about Wissahickon Trails. So we are a nonprofit conservation organization. We're based in Ambler, Pennsylvania, which is in Montgomery County. And this is just a photo of our office, which we affectionately call the barn because it was literally once a barn. We've been on since 1957. And since that time, we've successfully saved close to 1,300 acres of land from being developed in Montgomery County, which is quite a lot in an area that is constantly facing development and urbanization. So all of that land is spread out across 12 nature preserves that we own and manage, and all of them have trails that are open to the public. So we have a 12 trails. We don't get any state or federal funding except for some occasional grants. So we're really able to do all of the work that we do to preserve lands and maintain our trails for the public because we have the support of a really diverse community that shares our values. So if anyone lives in the area and you're not a supporter of Wissahickon Trails, but you believe in our mission, I hope that you'll consider becoming a supporter. So today we will be, this is in Whitman Township in Montgomery County. The map on the left is from our new website, and this shows all preserves in dark green. It's kind of hard to see on the map, but all of our lands basically hug the Wissahickon Creek, with a few preserves not right on it, but very nearby. And that is because one of our goals as we preserved all of this land over the years was to protect land surrounding waterways to help improve water quality. So like 10% of Philadelphia's drinking water is supplied by Wissahickon Creek. So the more natural lands that we protect around waterways, the more water passing over the landscape. So stormwater runoff, things like that that are collecting pollutants as they travel over paved areas toward the creek, the more that water is going to be filtered, natural lands over it, that's going to filter it and make it more clean when it finally enters the Wissahickon Creek. So we have all that land right along the creek, and along there we also have our Green Ribbon Trail. And then the preserves that are not directly on the creek, headwaters to streams that feed into it or tributaries that pass through it. So Crossways on the right-hand map is highlighted in yellow, which I did with a really sophisticated image editing software. So we're right across from Montgomery County Community College, Mercy University is nearby. The major roads are 202 and 476. So that's just to give you guys a little bit where we are. So without further ado, the slide will move forward. Oh, you're killing me, PowerPoint.
Tell you what, Margaret, for today, just
Yeah.
let me know when I'll be your faithful assistant.
Okay, sounds good. So welcome to Crossways, everybody. This is the scene that you will see before you if you arrive on like a June morning. This is probably my favorite preserve of all of ours, which maybe I shouldn't have favorites, but I do. So we've had this preserve since 1997. It was donated to Wissahickon Trails by the people that own the property, obviously, and they were very conservation minded, so they wanted to see this land preserved forever. So they entrusted it to us so that we could make sure it was always safe from development. It's a total of 57 acres with a real diversity of habitats. We had a natural resource inventory done a few years ago for, well, we did plants and insects and birds and mammals, but in terms of native plants, this preserve had the highest percentage of native plants, which is really cool and significant considering, you know, invasive species are a real problem for a lot of natural areas. And because that high diversity of native species and such a diversity of habitats is kind of like our golden child of preserves. And so it was the first one, a 10-year conservation management plan for, which essentially sets out our goals over a 10-year period for managing this preserve as best we can to support the species that are there and the species that we want to have come back or, you know, re-inhabit the preserve. So we put a lot of work into, like I said, doing inventories to see what kind of insects we had, what kind of mammals, birds, to get an understanding of what species need conservation, and then kind of base our goals around that. So we broke the preserve up. If you could go to the next slide, Kelly. So we kind of divided up all these habitats into what we call management units, and they all have species associated with them that we're focusing on. So they're kind of our conservation targets. So these are things that have been in decline. They're listed in the State Wildlife Action Plan as species of greatest conservation need, because we need to turn our attention to helping their populations. So Crossways has meadows, it has hardwood forests, it has really nice stands of evergreens, emergent wetlands, and streams. So there's a lot of different species that exist in those different areas that we're focused on managing for. So you can go to the next slide. So usually when I have a group of people out at Crossways or I'm just going birding by myself, I start out by heading down the Meadow Trail. So that's where we're going to begin our field trip. Next slide. So this is our restored meadow, and this is an area, it's about 6 acres, and it was completely overrun with invasive species. So it had a lot of multiflora rows and things like that. So we cleared all of that out and made sure it was fully eradicated. And then we went in to restore native warm season grasses and meadow grasses. And the reason we did that obviously is because invasive species like multiflora rows are far less beneficial to wildlife. So they don't produce the same nutritionally rich food as native species do. So we got rid of that and put in this native meadow, and we let the grasses establish for a few years. And then we can go to the next slide. And then we went in and seeded with wildflowers. So this is just a little overview of some of the things you'll see out there. On the top left is one of the major grasses that's out there, and that's big blue stem, also known as turkey foot, because it looks like a turkey foot. And this is a plant that provides cover for like 24 species of songbirds and nesting areas, and it's really good pollen for pollinators. And then we have a ton of mountain mint. It's the white flower there, which the bees really love, and wasps. These are some great blackback wasps. They're a really common sight at Crossways. And this smells amazing in June and July when you're out there. You can get whiffs of this really nice minty, meadowy smell. We have a lot of bee balm, scarlet bee balm, which is this one, and regular bee balm, cardinal flower, a ton of milkweed, brown-eyed Susans, some butterfly weed, and blue vervain. So those are all things that weren't there that we seeded in after we established a healthy meadow of grasses. Next slide. And as you continue into the meadow, you're going to see this weird structure out in the field. And this is our chimney swift tower. This was a really important partnership with Wyncote Audubon Society. So back in like 2016, along with Wyncote, we got it in our minds that we wanted to do everything we could to conserve chimney swifts. You can go to the next slide. Because this is a species that has been declining very rapidly. So for anyone who is a little bit new to birding, or if you're not really familiar with chimney swifts, these birds are aerial insectivores, which means they spend the majority of their life on the wing. They can't actually land or perch like other birds. They can only cling vertically. And they have adaptations for this in their elongated claws and in their very stiff tail feathers that give them support. So they also need textured surfaces to cling to, which they find in chimneys. And so their populations have really evolved a lot over time. Historically, they used dead wood for nesting and roosting, but of course, with European settlement and industrialization, they lost a lot of that habitat. Amazingly, they adapted very quickly to all that change by starting to use chimneys that people made for nesting and roosting. So they had a lot of success over the years that way. And now if you fast forward to the last like 50 decades, we have started to change the way that we design chimneys, which makes them unusable to swifts. And we've started removing or just not building them at all in new construction, or we cap them because we don't want birds nesting in them or wildlife coming in. So these birds have faced a lot of challenges in terms of habitat loss like that. And like other birds, climate change is a problem for them. You know, the more we have hurricanes and crazy storms, the more likely it is for them to have a difficult time migrating. And, you know, they're also losing habitat on their wintering grounds in South America. So they're facing a lot of challenges, and we're trying to do as much as we can to provide some habitat for them where possible. So with funding from Wyncote Audubon, who raised this money during Wissahickon Trail's annual birdathon for a few years in a row, we were able to build this tower and 3 other ones that we're hoping, the swifts will come and use and have some successful breeding. Next slide. And, we do a lot to study the birds of Crossways. Birds are an environmental indicator. So we are really focused on studying them to understand, the level of impact that our land management is having. Birds are high on the food chain, so they react very quickly to environmental changes lower down. So the more we manage to remove invasives and plant natives, the more we're hoping to be able to see that have a good impact on birds, which we will only know if we study them. So the main way we do that at Crossways is by participating in the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Project, which involves catching and banding wild birds. So this is a project that was started by the Institute of Bird Populations way back in 1989. So it's in its 29th year this year. So this project started because over the years, people seeing declines in bird populations from these annual monitoring projects like the Christmas bird count and breeding bird censuses. So we were seeing declines, but we couldn't really, sorry, I'm looking at the chat box. The towers can provide roosting areas and nesting areas. And that's an important thing too. So I didn't really mention this, but chimney swifts, after the breeding, family groups will join together, and then they migrate together and they roost together at night. So up to 1,000 birds can use one chimney for roosting. And they do that, because there's safety in numbers, and by all piling into one chimney together, they can retain their body heat more. So it's energetically sensible for them to migrate in groups. So the towers can be used for roosting, and they can be used for nesting, usually only one pair per chimney. So I hope that answers your question. And you can go ahead, Eric. So I was saying that, we were seeing bird population declines, but we weren't sure why they were happening. So the purpose of the maps, breeding birds, to look for a couple of different demographic parameters that are really important for population changes, mainly productivity, which is the amount of young, essentially, the rate at which young are being produced, which we can estimate by comparing the number of birds that are born in the current breeding season to the number of birds that are adults that were born in previous seasons. And survivorship is the other really important factor. And survival is key, really. Most songbirds breed in the same area year after year. So the proportion of banded birds that are recaptured the following year is a really good gauge of survival. And out of those two things, we can also get estimates of recruitment, which is another critical factor. And recruitment is the rate at which breeding individuals are added to a population. So that's either by surviving to breeding age or when other birds emigrate in from another population. And recruitment is critical because in a given population, you might be very productive. There might be lots of hatching chicks. But if too few of those chicks survive to make their own chicks, or too few individuals enter a population from elsewhere, that means low recruitment, and it results in population decline. So with all of our land management, we're really trying to ensure that the birds that Crossways have the resources they need to be very productive. So they need plenty of food and cover to produce lots of chicks. They have to have a lot of forage that they can eat before they migrate away, so that they have the storage of body fat that they need for their journeys. So that's partly why we manage the preserve so heavily. So to study the birds, we put out mist nets, which are these really fine nylon nets, and we have 8 of them on the preserve that are distributed as best we could in the different habitats there. So the birds are just flying around, going about their business. They can't see these nets. They hit them and drop into a pocket, and then we collect them and bring them back to a central banding area. And we only actually go out and band like 8 days out of the year, because again, it's a breeding season study. So we band from May to August, roughly every other week. And you can go to the next slide. So every bird gets a band. These are bands that are issued by the U.S. Geological Survey. They're all etched with a unique 9-digit number, and they're all lightweight aluminum. So they come closed, and we have special tools to open them and special pliers that we use to close them around a bird's leg. Next slide. And for every bird, we collect a lot of different information. The first thing we do after we band birds is age them, which, as I mentioned, is really important for looking at productivity and survival. And we can age birds by looking at their feathers. Differences in feather quality and wear and sheen and color can tell us if there's different generations of feathers on a bird's wing, which will tell us how old it is. And that's a complicated thing that's different for different kinds of birds. So I'm not going to get into that, but we can age them by looking at their feathers. And then we also look at their body fat. And this is really just a useful clue about food abundance. So by blowing the feathers away on a bird's belly, you can see their fat deposits. Their skin is translucent, so you can see subcutaneous fat stored in their clavicle and under their belly, which is going to look yellow compared to the purple muscle. So that's something that we rate on a scale of 0 to 6. And then we take a wing measurement, and then we weigh the birds, and those two things give us an idea of body mass. Next slide. One of the questions that I always get asked if I'm talking about catching wild birds is if they bite. So I had to throw this in there to say, yeah, they do. Some are worse than others. Catbirds are really not a big deal. Cardinals are terrible. Their bills were designed to crush seeds, so you can only imagine what that's like. And, you know, woodpeckers, of course, if they get the chance, they will hammer your hand like they would a tree, which isn't a great time. And red-winged blackbirds just have some of the pointiest bills, and they always go for your cuticles, like they know where your skin is sensitive. Next slide. And one of the coolest parts about studying the birds at Crossways and actually catching them is that you get this opportunity to see really cool features that they have. So for example, on a northern flicker, which is the first couple photos here, if you were to look at this bird through binoculars, you might not see or notice that their undertail coverts, the feathers that are just underneath there, have a heart-shaped central dot, which I think is just the coolest, and it's not something you're gonna see in the field unless you have that bird in your hand. And for great crested flycatchers, the second or the third and fourth photos, that's a bird that you might read in the field guide, has this really beautiful lemony yellow belly and this rufous colored wings. And that's again something that you can see with binoculars, but you can't really see the full beauty of these birds' plumage, you know, until you have them in your hand. And that last photo is a red-bellied woodpecker, which I know I speak for a lot of birders when I say when I learned about red-bellied woodpeckers, I was confused because they clearly didn't have a red belly. But when you scan, you can actually see that they actually do. Next slide. So since 2015, when the project started, we've caught 528 individuals. So these are all different birds that had their own unique band. And we've caught 35 species, which is pretty good. I should mention at Crossways, if you look at eBird, there have been 101 species documented there, which is pretty awesome. It's really good for migrants and breeding birds. So we've caught 35 species. probably around 30 actually breed preserve. And so these are 4 of the most exciting catches that we've had: a Swainson's thrush, a Canada warbler, a mourning warbler, and a Cooper's hawk. So those first 3 are all migrants. They're not going to stick around to breed, which means they're really exciting to catch. And we caught all 3 of those birds on the same morning in 2018. And this was the first day of banding. And that year there was a lot of rain and storms. And so our theory really is that migration was delayed for some birds. So these guys were still passing through when they really should have been done migrating. And they were just amazing to catch. It was like a little taste of spring banding in the summer. And the Cooper's hawk was wild. That's not, the songbird banding stations don't typically catch raptors. So it's very exciting when we do. And luckily we had a band for that guy. Slide. These are the birds that you will definitely see if you actually visit Crossways in person, and these catch the most: gray catbird, song sparrow, American robin, northern cardinal, and common yellowthroat. Next slide. These are birds that are all also common and breed there, but that we don't really catch very often. Eastern towhees were me and my coworkers' nemesis bird for a long time. It took us 5 years to catch them, and we would always hear them around the net taunting us, but we never caught one till last year. So I took like 87 pictures of this bird. And American goldfinches and tree swallows are really common in the meadows, and we hear them constantly when we're out there. This is a male and female orchard oriole, and usually there's a couple pairs of these breeding at the site. Red-eyed vireos are super common, and they're one that stays pretty high in the trees, so we don't catch them a lot. Only caught 2 in 5 years. Ruby-throated hummingbirds are always flying around in the meadows. Waxwing, same thing, they kind of stay up high, so we don't catch them very often. And that last bird is a willow flycatcher. And that's one of the birds that we are really actively managing habitat for, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Next slide. So if you go back out and continue your way down the meadow trail, next slide. You will see that we have some nest boxes out. We've had these out since like 2015 or so, and we only have 3. We have one set that is paired back to back, and another one that is freestanding. And that's just one of my favorite pictures ever. I was out there one day, and these tree swallow nestlings, I guess, heard me near the box and started begging for food. And I was like, guys, I'm not your mom. Next slide. The main species that we have in our nest boxes are tree swallows like these. If you've never seen their nests, they're really beautiful. We line them with feathers. And that picture on the end there is a nestling that I banded. It was probably like 12 days old or so. Next slide. Mainly what we're trying to attract out there with the nest boxes though is eastern bluebirds. So we typically have at least 1 pair breeding at Crossways every year. And these photos of juveniles, thrushes are really cool, and all thrushes will do this where when they're first born they have speckled plumage like this. And that's because after they hatch out and leave, they'll go woods to take cover, and that's where their parents will feed them. And having these speckled feathers kind of mimics like dappled sunlight in the woods and makes them harder for predators to find. Next slide. We were interested in learning more about the bluebirds we had at Crossways. So I started adding plastic color bands in addition to the aluminum USGS bands on their legs. And by doing that, we can essentially just look through our binoculars at a bird, read the colors on its legs and know exactly what bird that is, exactly who its mate is, whether it is a mate, the breeding pair, or if it's their nestlings. And that way we can get a lot of behavioral information out of them. So like we were interested in whether or not the bluebirds that were breeding at Crossways were the same ones we were seeing throughout the year in the winter, and whether or not family groups were staying together. So we did find out some of that information. And we also noticed that they use a lot more habitats than you might think. You know, so if you read about bluebirds, generally speaking, people think of them as meadow birds, but we found that they hang out a lot in the hardwood forests of Crossways. Next slide. So this scrub meadow area that you will see as you keep walking down the trail. And this is an area that we were managing for willow flycatchers. So it was very with invasives. It had a lot of, I'm looking at the chat real quick. They don't. So we don't put white color bands on young birds because they can look like fecal sacs of nestlings. So we avoid that because that could be a problem. But a lot of studies have gone into researching whether or not bands affect birds in the wild, and they do not. So it's very safe for them.
Hey, Margaret.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, when you answer the questions in the chat box, not everyone might not have it open, so if you could read the question too, that would.
Yes, that's a good point. That was, do the bands ever cause issues for the bird's natural functioning in the wild? So no, they don't.
Or we could just play a really complicated
version
of Jeopardy.
We could, yeah. Be like, try to guess why I'm randomly talking about bands again. All right, so back to the meadow improvement. So this area was overgrown with invasives. We pulled them out with some volunteers, and then we planted in native trees and shrubs that are tied to willow flycatchers. So willow flycatchers like to nest in alders and species of hawthorn. So we put a lot of those out there, along with other plants that are going to produce a lot more berries and nuts, which are good for wildlife and for insects. And next slide. And this is the edge of the woods where we did a similar project when we cleared invasives out from an area that's about 80 by 35 feet. We put up a deer fence to keep deer out of it. I did 70 native trees and shrubs. So this is again the idea of trying to increase the diversity and abundance of native plants because that's good for insects. That means it's good for birds. It's good for reptiles and amphibians that eat the insects and also the fruits. So we're just trying to always restore habitat and make resources more abundant for wildlife. And this is right on the edge of the woods. So you can go to the next slide. And this is really the heart of Crossways. It's 22 acres. We call it Harris Woods after the family that donated the preserve to us. And this area is listed on the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Database as a site of importance because of its ecological significance. So we know from aerial photos from 1942 that this area was maintained as a woodlight, and it was not cleared like much of the land around it was for agriculture. So it's a really cool, unique habitat that has a lot of old growth trees in it, a lot of hickories and oaks and beech trees. And it has a really nice layer of spring flowers. Next slide. And it's really important habitat for a lot of forest birds. Scarlet tanagers are one of them. We've named one at the banding station, which kills me because they're my favorite and I want to catch one. But we usually have a breeding pair that we hear singing throughout the summer. We always have a pair of red-tailed hawks. Yellow-billed cuckoos are a common migrant in the spring. And that photo of the nest is a wood thrush nest. And they are definitely a species of bird that has been declining a lot in the last few years, largely because of habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. So we are trying to restore understory in the forest for them because they breed at like the mid layer in the woods. So we typically have a couple pairs of wood thrushes on the, and that's one of their cute little nests. And the bottom left-hand picture is a hermit thrush. So they're a really common migrant, mostly in the fall, and they do stick around in winter on the preserve. And white-breasted nuthatches are really abundant. And we always have great horned owls, which we only know because whenever we go out for woodcock walks, we don't see woodcocks, but we see great horned owls. And I'll take it, it's fine. Next slide. Harris Woods has these really cool little pocket habitats, like this freshwater wetland. So it's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service designated wetland, but it has a lot of skunk cabbage, a lot of native wetland plants that are really good for pollinators and other things. Next slide. We wanted to increase the amount of water resources that were available for wildlife on the preserve. So we created this vernal pool. And this was a really cool project because we worked with the adjacent landowner who has horses, and she had a lot of flooding on her property. So when she would take her horses out in the winter, it was really dangerous because they were slipping on the ice and everything. So we worked with her to take water off her property and make use of it. So now there is an underground pipe that's a perforated underground pipe that runs from her property into the woods and supplies water to this pool in the spring and fall. And again, we put a fence around it because we have to fence in everything we care about these days from the deer. So this area holds water throughout parts of the year, and it's really important habitat for reptiles and amphibians. If you go there in the summer, there's a million green frogs all around it. Next slide. And we have a lot of reptiles and amphibians at Crossways. So these are eastern red-backed salamanders, which also come in a lead phase, and eastern box turtles. And that's another species that we're really trying to manage for. They are listed as an IUCN vulnerable species, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And a listing of vulnerability like that means that their populations are really likely to become extirpated from where they are locally. So one of the things that they need for their populations is that they have to be near a water source, and they have to have these little rural areas and creeks and things. So they're part of the reason why we installed the vernal pool. And we have a lot of snakes on the property too. So this is a decayed brown snake. Next slide. And as you know, the same way that we want to monitor birds for as a measure of our impact of land management, we're similarly monitoring salamanders. So my coworker, who is a senior naturalist, established a monitoring project for salamanders. So we're really trying to basically get a baseline of what species we have present and a relative abundance of those species. And so that will help us understand over time and keep track of trends in their populations. So we have cover boards out on preserve in the woods, and we have citizen scientists who go out and flip the boards and look for salamanders. And if they find any, and they ID them, and they measure them and weigh them and record some things about the site, so the soil temperature and things like that. And we have like, I think 5 transects of 10 boards. So there's 50 of these cover boards out there that our citizen scientists go out and monitor for us, and then they give us that data at the end of the season. Next slide. So I've been talking about deer exclosures a lot. This is our largest one. So if you were to continue down the meadow trail, you would come to this. This is our largest one. It surrounds a 2.5 acre area. Next slide. And we chose that 2.5 acres because within the deer exclosure, there's this emergent wetland that has a lot of good native species like cattail and New York ironweed and turtlehead, and a lot of different things that are important for declining wetland butterflies. So that's why we built the exclosure where we built it, to protect that habitat from deer. So we go in periodically and remove invasives with different. And then we have planted a lot of the host and nectar plants that butterflies need. Specifically, there's like 6 species that we're managing for. Next slide. If you're into birds, you might very easily get into butterflies. So I wanted to throw in some pictures of the most common butterflies at Crossways. Red-banded hair streaks, silvery spotted skippers, eastern tiger swallowtails. Little wood satyrs are all over the woods in the summer. Orange sulfurs, we have a lot of different kinds of sulfurs. Red admirals, common buckeyes, sabulon skippers, pearl crescents, and then the dark form of eastern tiger swallowtails. Next slide. And of course we have monarchs, which we are managing for as well by trying to plant more milkweed. And our senior naturalist also established a monitoring project for their population. So she collects eggs from the wild and she raises the caterpillars, and then she tags the monarchs. So she tags monarchs that she has raised from the preserve, and also any migrants that are passing through. So she'll go out and catch them in the fields. And this is part of Monarch Watch, which started, I think, about 30 years ago. And really the purpose is to associate the location of original captive butterflies come from with the point of recovery in Mexico. So we're trying to learn more about monarch migration. Do the monarchs that breed at Crossways and migrate through Crossways make it to Mexico? And what is the timing of that like, and the pace of migration, and what is mortality like? So by tagging the butterflies that hatch out on the preserve and are migrating through, we're trying to kind of connect our area to different areas of the world and try to contribute to understanding more about monarch migration. Next slide. So that would kind of wrap up your walk through the meadow. And then if you come back up to the parking lot, you can take the Crossways Trail, which is a county trail that was built, I think, 3 or 4 years ago. It hugs the edge of the preserve. And as you're walking down it, you'll be walking through a thick corridor of arrowwood viburnums and silky dogwoods that the yellow warblers seem to love. So I threw in a picture of them. We've never caught them at the bank station. I think they're just outside of where our nets are. But there's so many of them there. And then you would come up to this little wetland area, which is again another really important habitat type for a lot of wildlife. We have a bat box out there. That's that little black thing on the pole. It's one of 2 bat boxes that we have on the preserve. So there's long-eared bats that are threatened and Indiana bats that are endangered. And we're not sure if we have them on the preserve, but we want to provide habitat for them, along with little brown bats and other species. And we have plans in the future to do some bat surveys so that we have a better idea of what populations we have, and then we can make better decisions about how to manage for them. And if you continue down that trail, you'll come to this very cool boardwalk that's over a small stream. And this part of the trail, it won an award from the county after it was installed because it was very sustainably designed. So it's made from recycled materials. And so is part of the path leading up to it. Like you can see chunks of tennis courts and things like that in it. So it's a really cool example of how we can build new trails in a sustainable way with recycled materials. And that's pretty much where you would get to the edge of the preserve and then make your way back to the parking lot. So thanks for visiting Crossways, and I hope you guys will be able to get the chance to get out there and see it for yourself one day. And I guess we'll take any questions.
So I had made it earlier today that Margaret's presentation was going to be 3.5 hours long, and now I truly feel like I could easily sit here for 3.5 hours and listen to her talk more. If any of you,
Thank you.
you're welcome. If any of you have questions for Margaret, you can either drop them into the chat box, it's still open, or just hover over the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and unmute yourself and ask your question out loud. But we'll stick around for a few more minutes and answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, so I saw one come through about the local deer population. So we do allow hunting on our preserves, but only bow hunting. And we only allow hunters that we've vetted through a certain program, because a lot of our preserves are right near people's homes. But we do a lot to manage the populations on our lands. There's a lot of things coming in. How long do monarchs live? I don't know. I think they only live one season. Like, I think they, I don't know. I don't want to put my foot in my mouth here. I think that they hatch out and then they migrate down to Mexico and then they come back. I think they only have like a 1 or 2 year life cycle. I'm not sure. Let's see. I was wondering if catching these birds ever hurts them when they try to get out of the nets. So it doesn't. So when they fly into the nets, they land, they fall down into kind of a pocket and they can get pretty tangled, but it doesn't injure them. And I and my coworker have been trained to extract them carefully, so we know how to remove the net from their wings and their feet without causing any injury to them.
Margaret, you have a question from Luann, who I'm going to unmute right now. Or I'm going to try to unmute.
Okay.
Luann, if you are able to do it from your end, I have been forbidden from unmuting you.
I see some people answering the monarch question, so thank you. Kelly Jocelyn is one of my coworkers, and she says monarchs live a couple weeks as adults, except the generation that migrates. Thank you, Kelly.
Okay, Luann is officially unmuted.
I'm such a newbie to this. I have no idea what I'm doing. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
It took me a long time to get this stuff installed, and so I only came in on half of this, unfortunately. Is this recorded so that I can see the entirety of it?
It is. I will send out a link to everyone. Usually the recording is up within a day or two.
Oh, super. It was really, really, really enjoyable. I would love to see many more of these. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I see another question. I once spotted a salamander behind our home in Warminster. Are they very rare? It depends on the kind of salamander. So we have a few species that are super common, like red-backed salamanders, two-line salamanders are probably the most common that we have. And we have red salamanders also. The first two, if you see them, they're not very rare. If you saw a spotted salamander or a marbled salamander, that would be amazing.
Okay, last call. Any other questions for Margaret? All right, then Margaret, on behalf of all of us here today and from Audubon, Pennsylvania, thank you so much for doing this for us. This was a fantastic field trip, and I, for one, cannot wait to get out to Crossways.
Great, I'm so glad. Thank you for allowing me the chance to share it with everyone. I had a really good time.
Oh, you got emoji applause.
Wow. Oh, I feel honored.
You're getting a lot of.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, well, I'm going to sign off for today. Apologies for the Just saw a squirrel in the backyard on my end. Our next field trip will be Wednesday on Earth Day. It'll be Lord Jackson's backyard, which is about 100 acres worth of wildflowers, species. It is an incredible tour. So I hope you join us for that. Look for your invitation tomorrow. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out by email. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Margaret. This was wonderful.
Thank you too. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.